In a quiet corner of the heartland, where dusty roads carve through golden fields, and time seems to pause, an ordinary farmer makes an extraordinary choice. Joe, a stoic man of the soil, stops his rumbling tractor to give a ride to a stranded stranger, Lena, a sharp city-born aviation engineer fleeing burnout and seeking something real. What begins as a bumpy, silent ride down a country lane sparks a ripple neither of them sees coming. Lena returns to her world inspired, designing a plane rooted in simplicity and resilience, values born from that one brief encounter. Months later, she returns not just with gratitude, but in the cockpit of a new aircraft, flying low over the very farm where it all began. This is the story of unexpected connection, of how one act of kindness can launch an entire journey across miles, minds, and skies. It's about roots and wings and the strange ways people change each other without even trying. When Lena steps off the plane with a single question, "Want to learn to fly?" Joe's quiet life lifts into the air, proving that sometimes the most powerful journeys begin on a dirt road with nothing more than a gesture and a tractor ride. The late afternoon sun spilled across the horizon like honey, slow and golden. Heat shimmered off the gravel road that stretched through the heart of the Midwest farmland, silent and unassuming. Out here, even the wind seemed to whisper instead of speak. It was the kind of place that didn't make headlines, didn't ask for attention. It just was. Day in, day out. Joe Patterson knew this road better than most. He'd ridden it in rain, in wind, under snow, and now, once again, under the relentless summer heat. His tractor chugged along at its usual pace, each wheel turning in time with his thoughts. Steady, methodical, familiar. At 65, Joe had become a fixture in these parts. Most people don't remember a time before he was here. He wasn't famous or particularly social, but if you needed help, Joe was the kind of man who'd show up without being asked. The tractor was old, like him, and loud enough to drown out the world if he wanted it to. But today, Joe heard something over the hum of the engine, a faint foreign sound. It was heels. Yes, the distinct click of heels on gravel, a rhythm that had no business on a farm road. He squinted down the stretch of dust and saw her. A woman, mid-30s, hair pulled back in a ponytail that had lost its battle with the wind, walking with the determined pace of someone who regretted every decision that brought her here. Her blouse was smart, her slacks tailored, but the dust had claimed both. She had a leather bag slung across her shoulder, and her shoes, those doomed city heels, were collecting pebbles like souvenirs. Joe slowed the tractor to a crawl as he approached, pulling to a stop beside her. She paused, brushing sweat from her brow, then looked up at him with a mix of exhaustion and slight disbelief. "You lost?" he asked, voice gravelly from years of sun and silence. She hesitated. "My rental broke down about 3 miles back. No signal. I was headed into Millbrook." He nodded once, scanning the horizon. Millbrook was another 6 miles out. Not exactly a pleasant walk in this heat. "I can give you a ride," he said simply, jerking a thumb at the flatbed behind the tractor. She looked at it, then back at him. Her eyes said she'd never been offered a ride like this before. Still, she didn't hesitate long. "I guess I'm not in a position to be picky." She climbed up awkwardly, planting herself on the edge of the flatbed. Dust swirled around her as the engine roared back to life. For the next 20 minutes they rode in relative silence. Joe kept his eyes on the road. Lena, as she later introduced herself, kept her eyes on the endless horizon, arms wrapped around her bag like it was a lifeline. The tractor creaked and growled, carving its path through fields of corn that whispered in the wind. "So," she said, finally breaking the quiet, "do you do this often? Pick up strangers on back roads?" Joe grunted. "Don't usually see many." She laughed lightly, though it came out more like a sigh. "Figures. This wasn't exactly my plan today." "What was it?" "I came out here to clear my head," she said. "Turns out clearing your head gets complicated when your GPS dies and your car decides to take a nap in the sun." Joe allowed himself a small smile. "City girl? Born and raised." He nodded again. "Figured." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, just still, like everything else out here. Lena found herself oddly comforted by it. She didn't need to fill it. Neither did he. It was the kind of quiet that asked for nothing but your presence. When they reached the outskirts of Millbrook, Joe brought the tractor to a stop near the lone diner that sat at the town's edge like a sentinel. He pointed with his chin. "They'll let you use the phone inside, probably even feed you if you ask nice." She hopped down from the flatbed, brushing off her pants. "Thanks for the ride and for not asking too many questions." He shrugged. "Not my business." She took a few steps, then turned back. "I'm Lena, by the way." "Joe." She nodded, smiling. "Maybe I'll see you around, Joe." "Maybe," he said, then tipped his cap and drove off, the dust cloud rising behind him like a curtain closing. What Joe didn't see was Lena watching him go, eyebrows drawn together in thought. Something about him stuck with her, not just his kindness, but the way he seemed stitched into the land itself. Unmovable, real, and deep down a seed was planted. Not the kind that grows in soil, but the kind that takes flight. Absolutely. Here's the expanded narrative for 2 days had passed since the tractor ride, but the image of Joe, silent, sunburned, steady, still lingered in Lena's mind. Back at her rented cabin in Millbrook, the kind of rustic place with creaky floors and wild flowers blooming uninvited at the windowsill, she replayed the bumpy journey like a memory she didn't want to admit had meaning. Something about that ride had done more than get her to town. It had stopped the spinning in her head. Lena had come to the Midwest for a sabbatical, though she refused to call it that out loud. To the people at her firm, she was on a research hiatus. To her boss, it was strategic downtime. But to Lena, it was an escape. Burnout had crept up like erosion, slow and constant until she was hollowed out. She had always loved planes, the math, the design, the raw miracle of flight. But over time she had grown more fluent in deliverables than in dreams. So she'd packed up and come here, looking for stillness. What she hadn't expected was a tractor. On the third morning, her curiosity got the better of her. She asked the waitress at the diner, Susan, who knew everyone and everything, if she knew the farmer who'd given her a ride. "You mean Joe Patterson?" "Sure, everybody knows Joe," Susan said with a tilt of her head. "Lives out past Old Pine Road near the Bend by Thompson Creek." Lena scribbled it down like she was chasing a deadline again. That afternoon she set out, not by tractor this time, but on foot, determined. The heat was back, but she didn't care. The walk was longer than she thought, the grass taller, the bugs bolder. But just as her legs began to protest, she spotted a figure in the distance, bent over a fence post with a hammer. "Joe!" she called, then instantly felt foolish. Why was she yelling? He looked up, wiped his brow with a sleeve, and straightened. "You get lost again?" She laughed breathlessly. "No, I just wanted to say thanks properly." Joe gave a one-shoulder shrug. Didn't do much. You did enough, she said, stepping closer. You didn't know me. Could have driven right past. He didn't argue, just looked at her the way trees might look at storm clouds, curiously, without concern. I've been thinking about that ride, Lena admitted. It reminded me of something I lost, or maybe something I never had. Joe didn't speak, but his eyes said, Go on. I used to dream about flying, not just building planes, but the feeling of it, freedom. But somewhere along the way I traded wonder for meetings. Joe pointed to a nearby stump. Sit. You talk better when you breathe. So she did, and to her own surprise she kept talking about the pace of city life, about the exhaustion that comes from success without satisfaction, and Joe listened, not to respond, but to hear. In return, he spoke little, just observations, quiet nods, a dry chuckle now and then, but his presence grounded her. When the sky began to pinken, she stood. I'm going to build something, she said, something that matters, and when I do, I want to show you. Joe nodded once, slow as a sundown, and just like that, the girl with the ruined heels left the farmer with dust on his boots, and a promise hanging in the air. Back in her cabin, Lena couldn't sleep. The fan rattled overhead like an old engine refusing to quit, and the crickets outside performed their nightly symphony with no conductor. But it wasn't the noise keeping her up. It was an idea. She pulled out her sketchbook, the one that hadn't seen fresh graphite in months. On the first blank page, she drew the tractor. Then she added wings. Lena was a trained aerospace engineer, educated at MIT, with her name on 2 patents and a 3rd in review. But somewhere in that journey, she'd stopped drawing for joy. Everything had become functional, practical, safe. Now she let the pencil move without blueprint constraints. The plane she envisioned wasn't a marvel of speed or sleek design. It was sturdy, reliable, efficient, a hybrid, part bush plane, part commuter shuttle, built for communities like Millbrook, rural towns that lacked access to fast travel. It would run on biofuel with modular cargo space and reinforced landing gear for gravel runways or dirt roads. She labeled it the Prairie. Over the next week, she refined the design. She called an old friend at the firm under the guise of consultation, and by week's end, she had buy-in to explore the prototype. Off the record for now. But through it all, Joe was in her thoughts. The way he hadn't tried to solve her, just made space for her. That ride, brief and bumpy, had recalibrated her entire direction. Back at the diner, Lena ran into Susan again. She ordered coffee, but lingered. What's Joe's story? She asked, casually. Susan looked over her glasses. Lost his wife 10 years back. Cancer, no kids, never left the farm, don't talk to strangers much. But he helped me, Lena said softly. He probably saw something in you worth helping, Susan replied. He doesn't waste his time. Lena finished her coffee in silence. She realized she wasn't just designing a plane. She was designing a way to give something back. It was early September when Lena returned to Joe's farm. The blueprints rolled under her arm like a sacred scroll. The corn was high, the air crisp, and the scent of the harvest hung thick. In the breeze, Joe was fixing the irrigation valve by the barn, as usual, with more patience than haste. You ever get tired of fixing things? Lena asked as she approached. I don't fix 'em, Joe said without looking up. I just keep 'em going. She smiled. Same thing. He straightened, brushing his hands on his jeans. You bring me a tractor this time? Better, she said. Come see. They sat under the awning of his tool shed, and Lena unrolled the plans on the hood of an old truck. She explained her vision, a simple, rugged plane that could take off from rough terrain, fly low distances, and serve both cargo and passengers. She pointed out the modular wings, the shock-absorbing undercarriage, the solar assist panels. Joe said nothing for a long time, then he looked her in the eye. "You want to fly it here?" She nodded. "Eventually, but first I wanted you to see it. You inspired it." He blinked, a rare flicker of emotion showing in the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes. Then softly he said, "My wife used to say that one good deed was like a seed. You never knew what it would grow into." Lena looked down at the blueprint. "Looks like it might grow wings." Joe chuckled. "Well then," he said, standing, "I suppose we better start clearing a place for it to land." They spent the rest of the afternoon walking the fields, marking flat stretches, measuring wind direction with blades of grass and spit, a method Joe swore by. Lena laughed more that day than she had in months. Neither said it aloud, but they both knew something rare had happened. An idea had taken root, and soon it would rise. Wind carried dust across the fields as Lena leaned against the fence post, watching Joe guide a bale of hay onto a cart. She has returned to the farm almost daily now, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with questions about the land, and often with blueprints under her arm. The oddity of their pairing, a city-born engineer and a quiet, aging farmer, had long worn off. Now it felt like part of the rhythm of this place. Lena was moving quickly on her project. After months of drifting, she had direction again. A small research grant had come through thanks to her pitch and her reputation. With it came validation and responsibility. The prototype of the prairie could move into early modeling and testing, but she wasn't rushing. Something inside her had shifted. She didn't just want the plane to fly, she wanted it to mean something. One morning, after helping Joe patch a hole in the chicken coop roof, she spread her updated blueprints out on the tailgate of his truck. "You know," she said, pointing at a section near the wings, "this whole plane is designed to serve places like this, remote towns, farming communities, airstrips, optional." Joe glanced down, squinting. "Looks like a barn with wings." Lena laughed. "Exactly." He studied her with quiet amusement. "Why tell me all this?" "Because it started with you. I was lost. You stopped. You helped without asking who I was or what I could offer back. That meant something." Joe tapped a spot on the sketch. "This the cargo area?" "Yep. Modular bays. Could load crates of equipment, food, even medicine." He nodded. "Useful." They stood quietly for a few minutes, watching birds pick at scattered grain in the dirt. Lena broke the silence. "I'm going back to the city for a few weeks. I've got to move the project forward, but I'll be back." Joe didn't ask when. He didn't need to. "You've got work to do," he said simply. "Go do it." As she walked away that afternoon, her boots thick with mud, Lena turned for one last look. Joe was already back to work, but he paused just long enough to raise a hand. A seed had been planted between them, not just of friendship, but of shared purpose. And the wind, steady and warm, carried it farther than either of them could see. 3 weeks later, Lena was back, but this time not with blueprints, not with sketches or grant proposals or performance simulations. She came with something far less tangible and far more important: clarity. She found Joe near the soybean rows, repairing a chain on his plow. He glanced up at her approach but didn't rise. "Didn't expect you so soon." "I needed air," Lena said, "and not the recycled kind." Joe stood and stretched. How's the plane coming? Good, real good. They've got the full-scale model halfway done. First test in 6 weeks. We're naming it the Prairie. He smiled at that. Sounds like home. Lena tilted her head toward the tractor. Can we go for a ride? Joe looked skeptical. You don't need a lift. I know, I want one. He shrugged, wiping his hands on a rag. Suit yourself. They rumbled across the fields, the tractor engine growling beneath them like a reliable old dog. Dust spiraled around the wheels. Birds scattered at their passing. Lena sat beside Joe on the sideboard, hair whipping in the wind, the scent of alfalfa heavy in the air. This, she said after a long silence, is where I remembered who I was. Joe didn't answer. He didn't have to. As they rolled past the low fence near the western field, Lena spoke again. My dad used to take me flying when I was a kid. He'd rent these tiny prop planes, nothing fancy, but I remember sitting beside him, watching clouds pass under the wing. He'd say, the sky belongs to anyone willing to reach for it. I forgot that somewhere along the way. Joe's hands stayed steady on the wheel. We all forget things. Doesn't mean we don't find them again. They created a small rise, and the land stretched before them like a green-gold sea. Lena leaned her head back and let the wind wash over her. Next time I visit, she said, eyes closed, I won't be on the tractor. Joe raised an eyebrow. No, I'm bringing a plane. That made him chuckle. You're gonna land that thing in my field. She opened one eye. If you cut the corn short, maybe. He shook his head, laughing softly. City folks are always trying to make trouble. But in his eyes, she saw something unexpected. Hope. 6 weeks later, as the morning mist rose off the fields and birds began their daily chatter, a low hum filled the sky over Millbrook. Joe stood near the edge of his barn, hand shielding his eyes as he watched the approaching shadow. It wasn't large, nor was it sleek or glamorous, but it moved with purpose, like a bird who knew its route, like a soul that had found its way home. The plane circled once, then lowered toward the open stretch of land Joe had cleared in advance, just in case. Its wheels kissed the grass, bouncing lightly before settling into a slow roll. It stopped 50 yards from where he stood. Lena emerged from the cockpit, goggles pushed back into her hair, grinning like a kid who'd ridden a roller coaster without permission. Permission to land? She called. Joe crossed his arms, unimpressed. You flattened my grass. She laughed and jogged toward him. Told you I'd be back. He examined the plane with a craftsman's eye. It was sturdy, wide-winged, painted soft gray with pale green accents. The word Prairie was hand-lettered beneath the cockpit window. Flies decently? He asked. Smooth, she said. Handles like a dream. He nodded slowly. You really built it. She looked at him. We built it. Joe looked at the sky, then at her. So, what now? She stepped closer, smile softening. Now I ask you a question. He raised an eyebrow. Lena met his gaze. Want to learn to fly? Joe blinked. Me? Why not? You taught me how to be still. I'll teach you how to move. He looked back at the plane, then at his hands, calloused from years of pulling life from the dirt. The idea of trading fields for skies was absurd, and yet... Joe exhaled. Let me get my hat. It was a dry October afternoon, and the wind had shifted without warning. Joe noticed it first as a faint scent, sharp and bitter, carried by the breeze. He looked up from the barn, instinct prickling at the back of his neck. Smoke. His boots were moving before he fully understood. By the time he crested the ridge, a thin column of smoke was rising from the far eastern field. Not a massive blaze, but not a campfire either. The grass, brittle from weeks without rain, had caught somewhere near the fence line. Whether from a discarded cigarette or a sun-glinted shard of glass, it didn't matter. Joe radioed the local volunteer fire crew, then grabbed 2 water barrels and his old rake. It was muscle memory. You didn't wait for help. You helped. By the time the trucks arrived, a small section of the soybean crop had been scorched, some fencing blackened. The damage could have been worse, should have been, but Joe had been fast, efficient. Still, he stood quietly, jaw tight as the firefighters doused the last of the embers. Lena landed an hour later, unaware. She'd been on a supply flight to a nearby county, testing the prairie's load balance with real cargo. As she approached, she saw the scorched patch, a wound in the otherwise golden earth. Joe stood beside it, stoic and still. "What happened?" she asked, rushing toward him. "Fire, caught fast, didn't lose the whole row." Lena looked at the damage. "You okay?" He nodded, but it was the kind of nod that spoke more of resilience than peace. "Insurance'll drag their feet," he muttered. "Always do." She touched his arm. "Let me help." He shook his head. "No charity." "It's not charity," she said gently. "It's reciprocity. What you gave me can't be measured in dollars." Joe didn't respond, just looked out at the scorched ground. "I'm not trying to fix you, Joe," she said. "I just want to stand beside you for once." That night, Lena sat in her cabin and made a call to her firm. The next morning, a formal proposal was filed. The Prairie Project would include an outreach fund, resources designated to support the very communities it was designed to serve. Joe didn't know it yet, but help was already on its way. Sometimes the wind brought fire, but sometimes it brought rain. 2 weeks later, on a calm autumn morning, Joe stood beside a neatly tilled field, watching the horizon. He wasn't sure why he felt nervous. He'd seen her fly in before, but this felt different. This time she wasn't coming alone. Lena had called ahead, cryptic as always. "You'll want to be outside around 10. At exactly 10:02, a familiar sound stirred the clouds. The prairie appeared, wings wide against the open sky. But it wasn't alone. Behind it followed a second plane, then a third. They came in staggered, each landing like dancers in a carefully choreographed sequence. Lena stepped out first, helmet in hand, grinning. "You brought friends," Joe said. "More like partners," she replied. "Meet the Prairie Outreach Fleet. Just 3 for now, more coming." From the second plane stepped an older woman in a tailored coat. From the third, a pair of engineers in casual jackets, each carrying equipment cases. Joe raised an eyebrow. "This a parade or a takeover?" Lena laughed. "Neither. This is a thank you." The team had come to install temporary infrastructure, a mobile logistics unit, satellite internet, and even a small weather station. Lena had pitched it as a pilot hub for testing rural outreach. What she hadn't said aloud, but what Joe began to sense, was that she'd tied the heart of the entire project to this very land. Later that day, after the last sensor was set and the others were heading back to town for the night, Lena sat beside Joe under the barn awning, sipping hot cider. "You really did all this?" he asked quietly. "No," she said. "We did." He looked out across the field, where the sun was beginning to dip, casting golden light across the plains. "I still think it's crazy," he muttered. She smiled. Most good ideas are. Joe wasn't used to people giving him things. He was used to giving his time, his tools, his hands. But accepting help, that was new. It sat uncomfortably on his shoulders like a coat 2 sizes too large. So when the outreach program officially transferred funds for the repair of his damaged fencing, replacement crop seedlings, and even a weather-resistant seed shed, he protested mildly. I didn't ask for all this, he told Lena. I know, she replied, but you planted the first seed. You don't get to argue with the harvest. Joe grumbled, but deep down he knew she was right. Later that week, the local paper came out to do a feature on the Prairie Project. They snapped a photo of Joe standing in front of one of the planes, arms crossed, face unreadable. When asked for a quote, he simply said, "She came with nothing but dust on her shoes. Now she's bringing us the sky." The reporter called it poetic. Joe rolled his eyes. That Sunday, Lena gave a talk at the community hall, explaining the mission, connecting rural regions through sustainable flight, expanding access to medicine, supplies, education. Afterward, Joe stood beside her as locals came forward, asking how to sign up, how to support. Joe didn't say much, but his presence was a signal, a seal of approval. And in the quiet afterward, as they walked back toward the barn, Lena slipped her arm through his. I meant it, you know, she said. You didn't just give me a ride. You reminded me why I ever got into the sky in the first place. Joe smiled slightly. And you reminded me the world's bigger than these fields. They stood at the edge of the pasture, watching the wind ripple the grass. You ready for your first flight lesson? She asked suddenly. Joe looked at her, surprised. Right now? She nodded. Right now. He hesitated, then turned toward the plane. All right then, let's go see what these wings can do.